in between, and what are the challenges in between. And there are some opportunities. First of all, some governments are looking at, maybe we don't focus on these two guys, let's look at our local and regional economies to build ourselves. They're finding new alternative modalities to survive in a contemporary world. And in cultural diplomacy, a key consideration of whose interest does it actually serve? The recipient or, the quarter? Whose interest does it serve? And this is something that has always been, because cultural diplomacy has always been a bilateral relationship. And this is something that's very, very important. It's historically been bilateral, right? And how do you then tease out what is the ultimate value? And the final point I would like to make is the fact that today you have a much aware domestic public on foreign policy decision. And the public does make a point of view about who do we want to be engaged with, who do we want to be friends with, and who do we want to actually have those cultural exchanges. And and historically, the context is very important. How, when we look at cultural diplomacy, much of it has been objectified and is very much object-centric. So we had objects, we had artifacts, we had food, we had flowers, we had textiles, we had animals being exchanged as part of cultural diplomacy. China's panda diplomacy, sending pandas to zoos, right? Textiles, when the Prime Minister of Nawaz Sharif came to power in Pakistan, Prime Minister Modi of India sent him saris to his mother. All right, textiles. All right. Singapore's diplomacy, when different royalty got married, they sent orchids from Singapore, to dress the dinner tables. All right. Food cultures. Thais and their food culture that is part of the diplomatic regime. And artifacts. Historically, art has been traveling exhibitions, traveling opportunities, and all of that. Objects of cultural diplomacy, activities, sports. Right, sports is one of the most national of entities, and sharing, a sportsman helps, and you know the whole soft diplomacy between Dennis Rodman and North Korea, right? You talk about arts and entertainment, and how the arts and entertainment are continually being toured globally as a representation of what my culture means. And finally, social mobility and access, where through education, through providing scholarships and partnerships, many governments have enabled nation states to create a diplomatic opportunity. So whether you look at the Fulbright systems or the Rhodes Scholar systems, these all contribute to the diplomatic engine. It oils the machinery effectively. Many of them, particularly the Americans, through the United States Information Services, they've been funding a lot of localized projects and developmental projects around themes of freedom of expression, human rights, to a range of things. And some of them also go into enabling NGOs to really, non-governmental agencies, supporting them, to really enhance cultural heritage and heritage development. So there's quite a lot of that process that's historically we are very, very familiar with, and governments feel it to be relatively simple. In Asia, gift giving is an important part of our culture, right? It's embedded in our ethos. But while in Western cultures it's not. It's a bit of a tough exchange, right? So then social mobility and access becomes the opportunity for them to undertake that. So this is, in my research, I find that increasingly shifting from the bilateral, there's a new emergence of what I call the new transnational diplomacy that's emerging. That, opportunities where the impact of nation states is across the board to many more societies and areas. So India started the National Yoga Day. It's a global initiative. Everyone's doing yoga, right? The Silk Road Chamber of International Commerce that China started. It's more than 81 chambers of commerce around the world on the Silk Road belt, and they're all coming together to develop trade initiatives, cultural initiatives. They're all partnering, and they also have a museums network under the Silk Road Chambers International Commerce. So everyone on the Silk Road is part of that cultural enterprise. You've got the Asia-Europe Foundation, which is based in Singapore, which really supports artists and cultural mobility of artists moving around the world, seed funding, funds coming from European countries and Asian countries. Australia now is a new transnational diplomacy of the Australian government that's really about giving funding to Australians to go out and really reach out through activities, projects, and enabling and defining what Australia now means. And so the whole idea of what Australia means. And a more recent new transnational diplomacy that's emerged is, I'm sure it's in the language that you all read, is called the quid pro quo, all right, of the Trumpian logic. All right, how do I negotiate my cultural diplomacy? Through I give, you give. All right, and that is cultural diplomacy on its own. It's not political tactic. It is cultural diplomacy, and this is what you get in return for something. So it's a transactionalized form of a diplomacy that's emerging. So very, very quickly, in Southeast Asia particularly, there are increasingly a new set of networks that are emerging, that are creating a process, that are pulling together what I call fluid cultures, that are artist collectives cultures that are fluid and are much more, free-forming cultures. You're getting collections of independent researchers who are not tied to institutions, and cultural workers who are not tied to institutions. They do some work with institutions, but they've got a lot of leg room in cultural intermediaries who are creating new routes and new mobilities, moving into new environments, new spaces, new places, and only because they've all been enabled by the digital world. So you can get someone, say, Phnom Penh going into Battambang, not just going to Siem Reap, going into places that others might not go into on a regular basis, and creating new cultural environments. And so what's happening is this is all being enabled by what I call digital acts. The digitality of society has enabled people to be much more confident to go out into these kinds of environments and create new immersive practices that blends together. And immersiveness is coming through interdisciplinary practices of art forms and practices, but it's also emerging because of a lack. That means I don't have the formal disciplines to capture in these environments. We are moving very rapidly. So how do I bring together a historian, a musician, a dancer, a policy expert all together to look at what we want to create in terms of our cultural enterprise? So in Southeast Asia, you find that a lot of archives are emerging that are starting to document and put some of these narratives together. You get organizations like collectives like Kunci in Indonesia, which is all about alternative pedagogies. All right. In Singapore, we set up ENCATC, which I'll talk about very, very quickly. And so what's happening is, in terms of education, we need to look at what are we educating people for. Where if we look at educational institutions having very 19th century models of education, then what is the 21st century model? Where it needs to have diverse and inclusionary voices, sustainable and immersive cross-disciplinary experiences, leadership that is both global and local in its engagement and empowerment, knowledge creation and looking for new ways or unconventional pedagogies, and creating what I call horizontal and fluid organization. So we don't need to look at things vertically. You don't need to move hierarchically, but we create horizontal movement much more fluidly, that people are sharing and cross-pollinating much more. And this needs to be embedded into curriculum, into education, that our module systems are starting to build this kind of consciousness, because these are actually happening on the ground. They are real experiences, real manifestations. So in this regard, 9 years ago, we set up the Asia Pacific Network of Culture, Education, Research in Singapore. And really to understand others through their contemporary practices. How do we start this? By conversations, by sharing, learning, and enabling, and to really look at a fluid collective for conversations. And when we set it up, we had a lot of challenges. People were saying, so who's the president of this? Who's the vice president of this collective? I said, but it's as fluid as it can be. How do we collect people? How do you let people to come in and leave? Co-opt, or opt in. So organizing conferences are an important part of it, but we started a series of labs. So we did one in Kuala Lumpur, we did one just recently in Vietnam. And just literally a day and a half to bring policymakers, artists, different interested parties, including politicians, to create a safe environment for just a day and a half to talk about issues of the time and for us to research and understand what's going on. And we try to organize concepts of leadership. What does leadership mean today? And ask these questions. In these kind of forums, just a day and a half, we try not to go beyond 2 days, right? And so that it's kept intensive. But it's built on something that's very, very much part of Southeast Asia. It is being convivial. Let's all be friendly. Let's all be friendly. It's not about the transaction. It is about let's give some food, let's exchange. And friendship is a very, very important value that we undermine often in policy making. So that's where I'm at. I think the process we are looking at is these networks and opportunities are providing us new ways to develop cultural diplomacy at the people-to-people level, at the community and constituent level. How do we build that and bring it into higher education so that we are actually producing a new generation of cultural leaders who can really transform a world that is fast breaking down rapidly because the relationship between foreign policy, public policy, and cultural policy are fast disappearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Professor Lucia Sama bring a general map of cultural policy and also touches various aspects of cultural policy, how to do it, organization and issues. And one of it, a lot most, is making friends. And well, making friends, there is no specific purpose when we want to make friends. It's just make friends. Making friends per se is to make friends. Simple like that. And also your talk bring me another key word. Perhaps it's not key word to some other people. Story. People like to share stories. And I like to listen to your story if it's interesting and worthwhile, sometimes hilarious, sometimes it's ridiculous, doesn't matter. Story are stories. If we can share our own story with people, that is interesting, or that is meaningful, and perhaps that is a good start. Thank you very much. We have the third speaker, Yoko Kawamura, please.
Thank you for introduction. I feel very much honored as a Japanese to sit in this kind of historic building. I'm getting nervous, but I would like to share today a little bit from my latest research project, which I think have many overlaps with the topics of my other colleagues. So it's called From Cultural Diplomacy to Cultural Relations Policy, looking at cultural diplomacy and relations from a broader perspective. I think that one of the common challenges we face today is the sustainability of cultural diversity in a peaceful and creative way. That is, how to attain stability and creative development of international society of the 21st century, where people with various cultural backgrounds move across borders. So I think so because the major feature of today's world is cross-border movement of people, goods, and information on a large scale and in unprecedented rapidity. But here, multiple questions come up to tackle this challenge. For example, how can we compare cultural diplomacies of different countries? And what is the right term to refer to the policy? Cultural diplomacy, relations, or public diplomacy, international cultural policy, etc. And third, how can we evaluate the complex long-term effects of cultural diplomacy as all cultural policies? So here, I think broader concepts for the research of cultural diplomacy or relations are necessary, synthesizing various approaches of international relations and of other disciplines, because we are overlapping with each other. I would like to propose two concepts here. One is management of international cultural relations, ICR, that is transmission, interchange and promotion of cultures for the coexistence and co-creation of people with different cultural backgrounds. And second is cultural relations policy, which I call CRP for convenience here. I am more interested in this, how a state commits to various efforts of such a field. So a state commitment to ICR management in various policy fields I call cultural relations policy. It is actually a comprehensive policy with 4 dimensions, which I introduce later. I use concept of culture in 3 terms, and I skip to the framework discussion for international cultural relations and its management. So today, various researchers of international relations and other disciplines are interested in how to construct the cultural dimension of international relations in a better way. So we are interested in the same topic, but we are in different field. In the disciplines of IR, there are 3 approaches on cultural aspects of international relations: analytical, administrative, and combined. First, analytical approach. It regards culture as an analytical framework in the research of international relations. So it's called international relations as intercultural or intersocietal relations. There are developments actually since 1970s in 2 strands. Well, one is focused on transnational phenomena like Mike Featherstone, for example, like global culture, world culture, etc. And secondly, like the very influential, so to speak, Samuel Huntington, focused on international relations as a rivalry of various culture or civilizations. And second approach, administrative approach, is represented by Joseph Nye's soft power approach. It regards culture as object to be administered and utilized, resource, asset, capital elements, so very much object-oriented, so to speak. And it can be called research on the management of cultural resources in international society. And actually it is possible to combine the 2 approaches, although many scholars take only one of the 2 approaches. And I think it is important to combine the 2 approaches today. That is, to regard international relations as relations of different culture of various dimensions, and at the same time to focus on management of such relations with cultural resources and means. So I call it such research, combined research approach, research on international cultural relations and its management. So it's a convenient term, so to speak. And in the world of IR discipline, for example, research on history of cultural exchange and cultural diplomacy focused on, took this kind of combined approaches. And many monographs by practitioners of cultural diplomacy also take this combined approach. But on the other hand, in other disciplines than in international relations where I belong to, there are many developments in similar topics. For example, in cultural anthropology, sociology, etc., they all have focused on the management of cultural resources, and their research focuses today more and more global and international context. And research is on other related topics, for example, intercultural education or migration, integration, international civil society, and management of even local authorities and enterprises. They also take feature of management of cultural resources in intercultural context, so to speak. So, there are 2 approaches in IR and combined approaches, and there are also focus in international cultural relations in other approaches. So here I would like to develop a new, or how to say, comprehensive concept of ICR management. So, now I would like to skip to CRP discussion because I think it's more important for the audience today. Definitions and names and fields of cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy differ actually in various countries and regions. In some countries they do it in foreign policy field, but other countries do it in domestic cultural policy or educational policy. Within one country, ICR management is conducted by different socio-political actors also, and within different administrative branches, and the balance of this mixture is different according to the historical experience of each country. So I would like to use CRP, the concept of CRP, as a sort of container of various approaches of ICR management conducted by the state, both directly and indirectly. So CRP is, that is, cultural policies of a state for the purpose of constructing better relations between groups of individuals with different cultural backgrounds. And it has 4 dimensions, I'd like to say. First, external. This is traditional cultural and public diplomacy within foreign policy, but it's not only, the CRP is not only external, it is also outward. For example, nation branding and transmission of national image. It is not only conducted by foreign ministry, but for example, economic and trade ministry, and this I would like to call outward cultural relations policy. And third, inbound is very active right now in Japan, for example, and maybe in Taiwan as well. Inbound policy is various policy to attract people from outside, such as inviting tourists or students and immigrant workers, etc. Yeah. And fourthly, and last but not least, inland cultural policy, cultural exchanges, promotion within one country by domestic educational and cultural policy towards its residents, promoting intercultural understanding and diversity management, and etc. So I present a sort of figure to sketch the rough picture of ICR management by the state. The arrows with different colors show different aspects of cultural relations policy. So there are, this is not policy actually. People, goods and information, they move across borders freely, but government would like to kind of regulate or control those flows in different ways by different ministries. And I don't have the time to explain everything, but there are different ways from different aspects, external, outward, inbound, and domestic, like that. And another figure is to show the planning and administration of cultural relations policy involving many different actors and occurring at different levels of policy. This figure shows the planning and administration of a project of CRP in the case of external cultural policy or cultural diplomacy, where State A hosts a lecture, for example, on its arts in State B. There you can see that there are different levels of actors, like government, and embassy. This is sort of external, and cultural organization on its own country and its branch, and maybe other collaborating actors in the country of State B. And there are also collaborating individuals like experts or cultural administrators and artists who plan and also who sometimes invent on their own such projects funded by the state. And finally, as a result of collaboration of all these different actors, finally an artist goes to stage B from stage A, and this is the only part the media focuses. But all the things happening behind is actually the most important part, I would say, because through one program there will be a more stronger relationship between various cultural actors in state A and state B. Do you understand what I mean? Yeah. So this kind of policy-making process is very long and also difficult to evaluate. Government evaluate only this part, but if you look at this part, even if this part is not really unsuccessful, if there is a collaboration between actors of state A and state B, you can say that maybe this project was a big success. That's what I mean. And if you look at cultural relations policy in this kind of comprehensive way, you can see many things we have missed so far. So I don't know how you respond to this kind of new idea. Well, do I still have time? Or, yeah? But I have to explain 3 unique characters of CRP as policy practice, but maybe I can talk later on. So, to wrap up my discussion, I think adopting new broader concepts of CRP or RCR management is really crucial for us to tackle the challenges of today. So consideration of various cultural policies or exchange policies which have been handled within different policy fields or administration branches within one framework. This enables comparative studies much easier. And secondly, these kind of broad concepts broad the scope of planning, administration, and impact of cultural policy. So it enables assessing the long-term social-cultural impact of cultural policy that would become possible for the new concept. Thank you so much for kind attention and enduring my bad English. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And you bring about a very comprehensive idea of the analytical and the structural concept on cultural policy. And when it comes to the structure, I think that if we tell the politician or the public servicemen that let me tell you a good story about culture, they wouldn't like to listen. But if they tell them, if you persuade them that let me provide you with the analytical and comprehensive structure of culture policies, and they would like to listen. But as a matter of fact, the inside of such kind of different model, they all contain good stories, but a different way. And I appreciate that you provide a very good structure for us to think about it, and that is kind of very useful to me, and for us to understand that how to understand more about the relationship. Thank you. So we have the final speaker from Taiwan.
Thank you, Professor Leno, and thank you for everyone being here today. On the way here, I just chatted with Jerry and saying that as a student, you sometimes would like to escape from your supervisor because you think your work is not good enough. And today I consider myself very brave because I'm going to present in front of my supervisor. And myself started in Goldsmiths and starting as a master student in 2007 and later as a PhD student. And the reason why I have the interest of research about cultural diplomacy and cultural policy is basically a very personal one. And as previous speakers has mentioned, it's all about your personal identity. So when you're living abroad or studying abroad, it provides you